Hello and welcome to this video series on the ARP2600 where we're deconstructing it section by section, and today we're going to get a little bit more interesting with the tone. Where we left it last time was that we were able to generate a simple sound and understand where it had come from and how it was getting to the outside world, and that was the tone that we were generating. And that's passed from the VCO into the VCF, into the amplifier, into the mixer and out. Let's have a little bit more of a look at what's going on in VCO1. So that's a square wave. Now we can tell by listening to it that it's a square wave, but we can also see visibly because the normal connection into the filter gives us a little picture of a square wave. So it's telling us that VCO1 by default, its natural state is to generate a square wave. But it doesn't have to generate a square wave. There's another type of wave it can generate instead, which is a ramp or an inverse sawtooth. See this jack here? If we take a cable out of this, let's plug it into there. So what have we done? We've overridden the normal connection. Now VCO1 is not outputting a square wave into this slot of the VCF. It's outputting a saw wave instead, an inverse saw wave. So a typical classical saw wave starts off at maximum and then slopes down. An inverse saw wave starts off at minimum and slopes up till it reaches maximum and then falls off a cliff. But we're going to get a different tone. We're going to get a raspier kind of nasty sound. And there it is. So that is your classic sawtooth. We then have multiple default pitches that we can set that sawtooth at. So if I press C3, that's now playing C4, back to 3, there's C2, there's C1, and here's a low frequency oscillator where it's no longer audible. The fastest cycle it can get to is 30 Hertz, which is just about here audible. But that can then be used as a low frequency oscillator in some other source. We'll worry about that another time. But for the time being, that's our default tone. We then have fine-tune control over it. Any of these sliders, if you double click in them, it resets it to the default position, which in the case of these tuners is 0%. And then up here we have a semitone control as well. So that's really handy if you want to set like two oscillators a fifth apart, a perfect fifth apart. Then you would set one at 0 and one at +7 semitones, and then every time that you played a note you'd get a perfect fifth above it. So that's our basic sound, and VCO1 is very straightforward. This other jack here, which says square, let's just take this away for a moment. You can either disconnect the cable that way and then it'll disappear, or if I put that back in, if I right click on either of the jacks, I can say remove connection and that will just take the cable away. So now we're back to our square wave. If I take a cable out of this and plug it into VCO, it has no impact on the sound whatsoever. That's the natural sound that the VCO1 is generating. It's just that because this is a cabled output, I could now send this square wave wherever I want. That's just another output source available to me. Don't forget, this here is a default, a normal connection, a normaled connection internally inside the machine, but it can be overridden, and if we want our output to go somewhere else, that's how we do it. So that's basically it for your core functionality of the VCO. Let's have a look at these things down here. What's going on here? Well, we've already got one of the sliders turned up, keyboard control. Now a really good way to show you what the keyboard control voltage slider really does is to get span on the case. Now let's press a note on the keyboard. So that's at 263, I know, is the fundamental frequency of C. Now the fundamental frequency is at 131.5, which is a C an octave lower. So you can see that control slider varying between like 0 and 1 virtual volts. And so because we want to hear all of those key follows across the keyboard, we turn the slider up. We've got 3 other controls here. What do they do? Well, their normal positions are sample and hold out. Sample and hold is an entire subject in its own right. We'll come back to it. Don't worry. ADSR we can deal with now. So, there's my tone. Now, we know the principles of ADSR. You've got an attack. How long does it take to get to our high point? Then we have decay. How long does it take to get from our high point to our sustain point? Then we have our sustain, which is an amount-based concept, not a time-based concept. When the signal reaches its sustain level, what value is it going to sustain at? And then the release time, we go back to our time-based measures. How long does it take to get down to 0? So attack, decay, and release are all time-based concepts. Sustain is a level-based concept. What do you think that's going to do to the tone when we plug it into the oscillator? Let's try it. So the ADSR is permanently connected, or is normaled to this slot here. It's pre-wired. So if I turn that slider up, this is what's going to happen. So the envelope is being applied to the pitch of the tone. These are all frequency modulation controls. Anything that you plug in to these sockets, and they're all pre-wired, is going to have some kind of effect on the pitch of the signal being output by the oscillator. So because we've wired this envelope in, the envelope is applying its shape to the pitch of the tone. Okay. And in fact, if we just increase the release time, that was interesting right at the end. You get a little bit of you get the ADSR envelope attempting to apply pitch reduction to the tone, but the amount of time over which that pitch reduction is being allowed to happen is determined by a different envelope, by this envelope here. It's the AR envelope that's connected to the amplifier. It specifies that after the key is released, the sound will continue for 95.2 milliseconds and no more. Over the course of that 95.2 milliseconds, the ADSR envelope is having an effect on the pitch. It's reducing the pitch of the tone, but it happens by such a tiny amount that it's barely noticeable. If I make the AR envelope longer, so the release time is now 400 milliseconds, still less than the ADSR. So now we get 400 milliseconds worth of attenuation of the pitch as applied by the ADSR envelope. So we're still in kind of our training wheels mode here, still trying to deal with concepts as simple as possible, but already we're starting to get some reasonably complex interactions between these modules. And if we're aware of the various ways that these things can interact, then we stand a chance of potentially using the synth to good effect. So that's really, really interesting. That. What's this fourth socket? Well, it says VCO2, and then there's a picture of a sine wave underneath. Now we haven't dealt with VCO2 yet, and we'll get there in the next video. Bear with me. But one thing that we can say, as a kind of spoiler, is that VCO2 is capable of generating sine waves. VCO1 isn't. VCO1 can only generate saw and square waves, but VCO2 can output sine waves. And VCO2 is normaled into this connection here. So this is a sine wave. What's going to happen if I turn that slider up? Let's find out. Okay, it sounds like static because VCO2 is currently set to audible frequency. It's operating in terms of hundreds of cycles, and so we can't hear those oscillations. If we turn VCO2 down into low frequency oscillator mode, it's still pretty fast, but we can hear it. And it's the pitch that it's actually affecting. If I bring this right down, that's the pitch of VCO1 being modulated by VCO2 in low frequency oscillator mode. If we reduce the effect, the range of pitches over which the oscillation is happening diminishes. And now that's starting to sound like a traditional LFO. That's the kind of thing that ordinarily you would take. It's exactly the same concept. The VCO2 is generating a low frequency sine wave. Okay, that's a pretty good place to stop. Next time we'll bring VCO2 fully into the equation, and then we'll start seeing how those two things relate to each other, and we'll have a look at a few of the idiosyncrasies of the normal connections to it. Thanks very much for watching. Hope to see you next time.